Thanks, Josh, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Where to start? Yeah, so I will just say, I am going to talk a little bit about bookmaking, and part of this is all that I have just maybe started my own publishing company or something like that, but I am going to talk about the process of how my sort of crazy process of making dummies, so feel free to poke through those dummies that these are a handful of my many thousands of dummies that I go through making. But, you know, either during or after, and also feel free to just ask questions, shout it out, interrupt me. I prefer that.
Okay.
Perfect. We're off to a good start already. All right, so I'm just going to jump in. I am going to talk about these three projects, sort of the first two briefly, just because they are it is a sort of the lineage of how we get from one place to the next, and that's kind of how I work. Is when I feel like one thing is done and over, I have to immediately start doing something else. But obviously I'm going to start talking about something totally different. And so this is just how I want to just give you a picture of how I kind of think about photography, which is that there's kind of like a magic to the unknown and the ambiguity. And so the other stupid thing I do is I spend a lot of money and time on eBay or like scouring dumpsters to find images that have lost their way. And I like that because I like that I get to make up the stories. That is completely up to me to decide what's going on within that. So this is actually a negative strip that I found on the streets in Northampton many years ago. I mean, not back in the 70s when this is from, weirdly, but in like the early 2000s. And this is just this amazing moment, which is like, I feel like the most relatable thing ever of this family photo, right? And the boy kisses the mom, and you can't really tell what kind of creature's on the girl's lap. And you know, we've all done it, right? And then the next one, of course, is where we swap. The dad needs to get into the picture, and somehow this picture always feels a little bit more, PG-13 rated. Why is dad not wearing a shirt? And why is he trying to cover himself up with the Afghan? And also that creature has now turned into like some demonic hell dog. So, this is a sort of narrative that starts to build, even in these two frames off of a strip of negatives. I have a couple more just to show you. I also am really into when things fail, which is not, I personally am not into it in my own work, but I love finding these things that fail or that history has deteriorated to give it a completely new meaning that then I kind of approach in a new way. And why is this important to my work, which you'll see is colorful and very straight, is that this is how I want people to approach my work, is that I don't think about it as being necessarily what it's about, right? The camera is never sort of pointed at something that's supposed to be necessarily the object in it. It's about how it's built and how the narrative gets built up through books. So books are my primary kind of vehicle. That's where I start thinking of things. And then from there, it kind of dissipates. If there's a wall to put it on, it goes from there. So I'll talk about this project kind of briefly. And in fact, what I'll actually do is I'm just going to leave this here while I talk about it, and then I'll read you a poem. Get used to it. So this work was made over a period of 10 years, kind of like when I was finishing grad school, and then moved back to Massachusetts and kept on photographing, feeling kind of lost. And it was put together after sort of a series. It's that moment in your life when things start to change, right? I can say that now that I'm in my 40s, but this is in my 20s, when people died and people were born, and they both kind of came with their own grief, either of those, and their own sort of celebrations. And it was a lot to sort of sort out, right? A lot to sort of understand. And so the way that this book sort of came to was it's broken up into 3 different chapters that are all reference to songs or poems. I keep going back to that. That's how I make sense of things. through poetry. And so this first part, which was sort of it's based on a rock and roll song, Neil Diamond, which is also not that cool, but it was the poetry and the songs inform the pacing and how the book goes together. So the first part is called "We Won't Need Bright Lights," and the second part is called "It Is Heavenly Weather," which is like a pause to think about, just like thinking about sort of a meditation, and then the last part is "Myths and Exhalations," which is about this idea of like the loss of innocence and the loss of people as well as birth and moving forward. So I'm going to try and do this in time while I read this poem and take a sip of water first. So there's a poem by Lawrence Ferlinghetti that sort of, while I was working on this, it just kind of fit and became the right poem and really helped to sort of frame this work. And it's called, the poem is called "The World is a Beautiful Place." Is that what it's called? Yeah. The world is a beautiful place to be born into. If you don't mind happiness, not always being so very much fun. If you don't mind a touch of hell now and then, just when everything is fine, because even in heaven, they don't sing all the time. The world is a beautiful place to be born into. If you don't mind some people dying all the time, or maybe only starving some of the time, which isn't half so bad. If it isn't you, oh, the world is a beautiful place to be born into. If you don't much mind a few dead minds in the higher places, or a bomb or two now and then in your upturned faces, or such other improprieties as our name-brand society is prey to with its men of distinction and its men of extinction, and its various segregations and congressional investigations and other constipations, to our fool flesh is heir to. Yes, the world is the best place of all, for a lot of such things as making the fun scene, and making the love scene, and making the sad scene, and singing low songs of having inspirations, and walking around, looking at everything, and smelling flowers, and goosing statues, and even thinking and kissing people, and making babies, and wearing pants, and waving hats, and dancing, and going swimming in rivers on picnics in the middle of the summer, and just generally living it up. Yes, but then right in the middle of it comes the smiling mortician. And so that's the framework for this project. And I don't want to dwell on this because I'm not here to talk about old work. But that's how it came together. This book was published then in 2017, which the world started to see a whole lot of different things happening. This all feels very, at this point, kind of twee right now, the throwing of paper towels. But so, 2017, this book came out and I felt pretty good about it. And then I started to look at the world around me, and it felt very kind of navel-gazy and very insular. And I felt like I wasn't doing my part as a photographer bearing witness. And my life had changed enough. I wasn't as young anymore. The people around me were getting kind of busy. So I was trying to think about things, and I also at the time had 2 young babies, one who's over there, not young anymore. And this was also one thing that was happening here. I very specifically remembered this moment in history, which was, we are talking so much about migration now, but at this point they were putting kids in cages. Remember that? No, which is actually part of it all. I couldn't travel. I felt bad. I felt that I couldn't explore the world that needed exploring. Which is where this next project started. So the local really started because of this idea that I couldn't travel, that I couldn't go see the things that I felt needed to be seen. And so the question to me was like, oh, what's right here at home? And it's kind of naive way of thinking of what's right at home. And I'd always been kind of toying with this idea of where Route 2 and 91 meet, which is right in Greenfield, which happens to be where I am all the time. And there's sort of this historical part of Route 2 being America's highway, as well as a Native American trading route, and also has these layers of sort of Americana as well as racism built in. And then there's 91, which there's the academic corridor, but then it's also the heroin highway, and so it's got this kind of all different things going on to it. So that's where this started. Yeah.
No, could you move the arrow on your screen?
I can point. Yeah. I should know that I'm a teacher. So it became this sort of wandering, which is also for me was this really freeing thing, which is I grew up around here, and this was something I used to do, just wander through Greenfield, Brattleboro with my Pentax and photograph whatever was there in this sort of, just what it is kind of way, photographing the world in front of me. So I was going around doing this without totally understanding, with this idea that I'm like photographing this drug problem, but I don't think I really like got it. And I just photographed whatever things that I guess marijuana's in there. So, but it was in this picture, which actually didn't make it into the book. But I met this guy actually through another person, Joe. I met Lincoln, who was just on this. We were chatting, and he was really open, and was just telling me. I asked him. I was like, "Well, where?" Like, if you're in Greenfield, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, and it's pretty similar to in Brattleboro. There's sort of an obvious unhoused population, but it's kind of confusing where everyone disappears to. And so I just asked him where he slept, and he told me. And then 2 weeks later, there was this sort of it was the summer of 2018, but this sort of accidental protest that happened in Greenfield, if anyone remembers this. But there was actually, it started with two people who, because I could really get bogged down in this. It was exciting. The way that the Common is in Greenfield, or in all of Massachusetts, all of New England, is that the Common is owned by the people. It's not owned by the city or the state. So you've got public access. It's because that's where you'd go to water your livestock. So a couple of people learned this, and they pitched a couple tents there, and then that grew, and then I think at the peak of it was like 30 tents right in the center of town, more than 30 tents, and 100 people at any given time just hanging out. And it was just like a fascinating experience to watch, and I started photographing that sort of against my better morals, just that sort of question, but it felt important because it was happening. And I kind of stopped working on the local altogether to focus on this without knowing what was going on. And it became, I interviewed, I recorded stories, and I actually made a zine that I was able to sell and give money back, which felt good. But in the end, I don't feel like the pictures are mine, but what it did do was it really formed what I was actually working on with the local, which I had this title came up, which I really liked, which came, again, here's my poetry. Because I'm focusing on a town, or really it's Franklin County, that's the idea, is Franklin County. That's kind of, it's the falling apart of industrial New England, right? These rural New England, these towns that kind of are old mill towns that don't have as much industry anymore. And I was because I need to frame it, I started looking at poetry about that. And the first poem that came up was T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, The Wasteland, which is all about, it's London, and it's sort of, but it's despair. It's about how horrible everything is. And that led me then to the sort of the rebuttal to that, which was Patterson by William Carlos Williams, which felt a lot more in line with what I was thinking about. And it's actually this line that's just in the beginning. I left all these little zines on your chairs. Some of this is in there. You can read it on your own time if you want. But that a man in himself is a city, beginning, seeking, achieving, and concluding his life in ways which the various aspects of the city may embody. if imaginatively conceived, any city, all the details of which may be made to voice his most intimate convictions. And that's this idea of the local, that the local is both, it's a person who exists in a place as well as a place itself. And so this sort of, and that's the whole poem of Paterson, right? Paterson is a person as well as the city of Paterson, New Jersey. And so that started to form this work, right? It was how do I fit into, how do I fit into this landscape? How am I part of this landscape? And what parts of this landscape have I actively ignored, right? By kind of keeping my head down and skating in my own lane. And so it's really an exploration of a place that I know really, really well, right? It's trying to sort of find an unknown amongst the familiar. And this went on, so I did this work was from, I don't know when I started it. I guess 2017 is when I started it. And then it was all sort of miraculously set. I don't know how I managed to do this, but it was going to be, I got a publisher, a really special publisher, Renowned Mac, which is a really, you know, if you're a nerd, it's a really important publisher. And it was scheduled to be published in 2020, in the summer of 2020. So I was, you know, all geared up to do this. I didn't have a contract, which made me incredibly nervous. And then March happened. And I had no idea what was going on. And I would talk to them, they're like, oh, it's still happening. And then all of a sudden it's not happening. So I was nervous. I think we all were. Sorry, I have too many images in here. And didn't really know what to do. Kind of in a manic state. Where this work existed, it was done, it had a place that it was supposed to be going, but I didn't know if it was going to be going there. And I didn't know what to do. So I was making dummies, and these are some of the dummies over here. And this is, I'm just going to sort of pause for a second to talk about this. Is a huge part of my practice and my process, is that I need to physically make these things so I can see the flow. So I did it a lot with the local, and they were often hand-stitched. Sort of, I think it takes me out of the photograph a bit, so I can do something that feels a little more crafty. And there you go, glue. And so I'm about to move into Good Bones, but going back in this time, I had all these images, right? I've been shooting over time. There's leftover images that didn't get into the local. There were images that I started to make at home because I wasn't going out. And the question was like, what are these, right? What was I even doing? And I think in my desperation of sort of staying relevant to myself, because I felt like I'd finally kind of struck gold with this publisher, and then that felt like it was being taken away from me, I had to continue to work. That was sort of part of my mania. But these images were all over the place. They really didn't have, I don't think I knew what I was doing. I wasn't interested, again, I wasn't interested in photographing the lines outside of Big Y or, you know, whatever was, I just wasn't, it wasn't interesting, and I don't think I felt safe doing it. Again, it was kind of concerns from my family. So to jump back to this idea of these sort of images, that the ambiguity of these images becomes really important to me, because also it gives me, when you start putting them together, right, when they start to make relationships, they start to create a new meaning. And that's, you know, like, which image does the photographer choose and why? And how does this become an important part of it? So, which is Good Bones was born out of all of this. This sort of really, and this is, I've been going through my notes, it's like, how do you talk about work that's really just about being confused? And that was a huge part of it for me. So again, similar to after Either Limits came out, when the local came out, I was like, this is great, but I don't want to continue making work where I just kind of parachute into some Rust Belt town and photograph and take that work back. So like what else but I am very married to this sort of style. I'm married to this sort of, I hate saying this, the post-documentary style, right? This, whatever you want to call it. Lyrical documentary. Documentary adjacent. These are a couple. I think I probably made 40 dummies of this before I was done with it, at least. So I'm gonna try and talk while this is actually what I'm gonna show you now is actually the complete edit of it as it is in the book. But I'm gonna talk and it's maybe not gonna line up with the images, but I'll try and do my best to make it interesting. So the very first, like when I first did this in this sort of like, panicky state, I was just kind of taking what I had and making a dummy. Just making a dummy and seeing what happened. And I was like, no, it doesn't look so bad. Which I can tell you now is there's maybe one image from that initial edit that's still in this edit. Sorry, just going through my notes, feeling lost. What I started thinking about, because I wasn't interested in photographing the actual pandemic. I wasn't interested in photographing the news. I started thinking about how an image can be read, right? And just to be extra photo nerdy with you today, started thinking about Stieglitz's idea of equivalence, but without using clouds and instead using business hour signs. And this idea of like how an image can be an equivalent for time. So thinking about this idea of time, not like a moment in time, a moment in one's life, a time in one's life, without it actually being the news, because the news was feeling completely untethered. And so this is also in the pandemic. So the first thing that I started looking up into, because I had heard about it but never really researched, but I started researching more about the 1918 pandemic. I think a lot of us did that because we were like, what the hell is this? And looking for some historical sort of cycle that we were part of. And there isn't a whole lot. It was actually kind of this disappeared part of history. But there is some, because it was also tied in with World War I, but there is some poetry. And the first poem that I found was this William Butler Yeats poem, which I don't actually think lined up, but the last line of it became really important to me, which is "Slouches towards Bethlehem to be born," which is this line that's, I think Joan Didion used it for a book, for the title of a book. And it's this idea that you're so just fucked up, but you're still moving forward. And that became a really important part of it, and sort of a building principle. So in doing that, it also kept on happening. Every time I would think I was done, and then I would show it to somebody and be like, oh, you could change it here, and then I would go back and kind of reconstruct the whole thing. And I realized that in 2020, there was this important thing that I was like, the first edit was like, I don't want to show anyone's face. Nobody's face should be visible because we're all so isolated. It's about this sort of being alone. And then in 2021, I went outside again, and people showed up. So they kind of found their way back in, which kind of screwed up my whole system. But there was a little more optimism. The sort of optimism crept in, and it didn't feel quite so despairing. That led to this idea of and that same line about slouching towards Bethlehem, that led to the idea of the title, Good Bones, which is, of course, a real estate term. That this place is run down, but you can fix it up. And so that became this sort of optimistic idea, or half optimistic, I guess, is the thought. And that once I had the title, it felt more like I had a direction, like this is a place to head in. But I'm still struggling with this idea of, in the book, like how do you build parameters? How do you build yourself? How do you build these sort of guardrails to keep the work moving forward? And like when you have a town or a county or whatever, you just say, I don't go outside the county, or you lie about it. But when I just this didn't feel like I could keep on doing this over and over without it ever having sort of any real direction, because I could just make it up, which I did. But this idea of sort of trying to get somewhere, trying to find some optimism, kind of is what carried this. And then I will read this poem, but this poem on the front, which is then I Google Good Bones poem, because that's what I do. I don't actually read, I just Google. But this really amazing poem by Maggie Smith, who's a contemporary poet, obviously popped up because it's called Good Bones, go figure. And it just kind of hit all the notes. It hit everything. So I'll read it. Life is short, though I keep this from my children. Life is short, and I've shortened mine in 1,000 delicious, ill-advised ways. 1,000 deliciously ill-advised ways. I'll keep from my children. The world is at least 50% terrible, and that's a conservative estimate, though I keep this from my children. For every bird, there is a stone thrown at a bird. For every loved child, a child broken, bagged, sunk in a lake. Life is short, and the world is at least half terrible. And for every kind stranger, there is one who would break you, though I keep this from my children. I am trying to sell them the world. Any decent realtor walking you through a real shithole chirps on about Good Bones. This place could be beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful. And so that was like, that's it, right? That's the idea of it. And that also then led me back again, where this idea where I'm kind of looking out into the world where I start, and the camera is pointing out towards the world and photographing the Vic. But then this idea that when children came back into it, it kind of again drew me back sort of internally. And that led me to these other thoughts, and these tropes that sort of show up in here. And when you can spend more time with this, but there's certain, and this goes back to the Yeats poem, which is very biblical, but there's certain religious tropes that happen a lot in here, particularly about the sort of the Edenic, the Genesis story of eating the apple and the loss of innocence. And that kind of continually shows up, as well as these sort of imperfect rainbows. These, rainbows keep on showing up, and they're always kind of not quite the ideal. And fallen angels, you'll see that in there too, as well as this. There's also what I found as sort of this, and this is how I show the work too, is that flowers become this sort of the narrative device that keeps it grounded. It's sort of the cement to it all, this one bit of stability that holds this insanity all together. And so, but also thinking back to the Spanish flu, I also started going through a bunch of different photographers' work, and in particularly, especially I think once we moved from the pandemic into riots and George Floyd, everything again felt very sort of reliving history, very much like my parents' generation when they were, my age. And so I started looking at work by this, and I thought you had it here, but you don't. But there's this really amazing book by Dave Heath, a photographer. It's called The Dialogue with Solitude, and it's real. That became the sort of template for what I was working on here, because what he does in that is he photographed in the Korean War, he photographed in Washington Square Park and the Beat Poets, he photographed, and they're these beautiful, lush, black and white images that have nothing to do with Washington Square Park and nothing to do with the Korean War, and all about to do with this sort of ennui that was being felt in the world in like I guess it would be the late early 60s and the 50s where everything was supposed to be kind of polished. So that work became really important. And then also this work by Gary Winogrand, which he didn't put together, but his Guggenheim application talks a lot about this, where it's just, what is so wrong with the world? Like, the world is so wrong, and I can't accept that. And that's why I take pictures. Which also, that's in here, I won't read it to you. But, and I started to realize, again, looking at that, I was like, these are also people, and in particularly, like, men my age at that time. And that also felt very kind of on point, that this is sort of, not to put too much of there's an imperfect rainbow, but that there was this sort of midlife-ness to it all, right? This sort of like looking out at the world, this imperfect world, and trying to figure out ways to fix it. Trying to think about ways that that it could be better, right? Or what, I mean, I guess not fix it, but how to think about how it could be better. And I will just read, so that I opened the book with this short quote. I'll read you the whole piece, but it's from Kurt Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions, which is, he wrote it on his 50th birthday, which he says here, which is like this book about his, he calls it his 50th birthday present to himself. But he goes into this idea too, right? That why is everything so wrong? And how can we accept that? So I'll just read it while I finish talking here. But as I approached my 50th birthday, I had become more and more enraged and mystified by the idiot decisions made by my countrymen. And then I had come suddenly to pity them, for I understood how innocent and natural it was for them to behave so abominably, and with such abominable results. They were doing their best to live like people invented in storybooks. This was the reason Americans shot each other so often. It was a convenient literary device for ending short stories and books. Why were so many Americans treated by their government as though their lives were as disposable as paper facial tissues? Because that was the way authors customarily treated bit-part players in their made-up tales. And so on. Once I understood what was making America such a dangerous, unhappy nation of people who had nothing to do with real life, I resolved to shun the storytelling. I would write about life. Every person would be exactly as important as any other. All facts would also be given equal weightiness. Nothing would be left out. Let others bring order to chaos. I would bring chaos to order. Instead, which I think I have done. If all writers would do that, then perhaps citizens, not in the literary trades, will understand that there is no order in the world around us, and we must adapt ourselves to the requirements of chaos instead. It is hard to adapt to chaos, but it can be done. I am living proof of that. It can be done. And so that was another thing that just kind of, where it completely congealed and made sense. That and the part that made sense was that nothing makes sense, which is a hard thing. I still am like, well, what the hell is this about? Which I think I know, because I'm talking about it right now. But I could edit this again next week and it would be totally different. So I'll finish up as I go through the last images. This in the end, this is about optimism, I think. It's about trying to find optimism, trying to think about a moment in time that we can learn from, that will probably be relived again 50 years down the road. It's about passing through life full of all of its anxieties and sadnesses and fears, but it's not without its joys. And I will just slowly go through the last few images. And I'm happy to take any questions. Yes, nice. Perfect rainbow.
Yeah.
So, you talk about like poetry and text as it collides in your work. You're also talking about like making these dummies. And I'm just curious, does the process of choosing a text or finding a text that kind of parallels with your work, or you feel like resonates within it a certain way, is that like part of your bookmaking process, would you say, and like how you sequence your photos?
No, I
Okay.
think it's part of my understanding the work.
Okay.
It has more to do with that. And like I said, I'm not a huge reader. I'm not actually, I'm throwing a lot of poetry at you and making it sound like I'm really well read, but I'm not. And what I think what I tend to do is I take these pictures and I don't understand what I'm doing, and I need somebody who's smarter than me to tell me what I'm doing. So I think that's why I go to poetry a lot. And I think photography, especially in this manner, is very poetic, and they are meant to sort of, live together.
Yeah, the pulse of this is, it has the rhythm of poetry, and whether you're thinking it like out loud in your head or not, that you're so instinctual about your sequencing, and this book is just so tight, and I know you could resequence it and tell a whole other story, but I think you've got the good bones down here. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Yeah.
I wonder if you could say more about how you approach people when you photograph them, like what kind of interactions you usually have, how long they last, how you're usually received, if there's a,
Totally different every time. I mean, well, that's not true. I mean, I know how I do it, and I know how it's totally cosplay for me, because I'm a shy person, and I keep my head down, but for whatever reason, and this is that the power dynamic of the camera, it's sort of a little bit, I mean, I had to train myself to do it again, especially when I started making the local, because I hadn't done it in years. And it was also, when I was a teenager walking around with my Pentax, people kind of knew that you were an art student, or, they didn't care. And that's changed a lot. So people are much more curious. But I mean, that sometimes is the case, is somebody will talk to me and I use that as I carry my camera very openly, to be seen. And if they stop me, that's my immediate, let's talk, and I'll ask you to take a picture probably. And it may not be good, but I'll probably do it. There are times where it's it's just being attuned to the world. And I try and think about what I'm interested, what I think about people, and a lot of this, especially in the people I see a lot. There's certain there's learning curves. With the local, I was much like hunter-gatherer type thing, where you got the shot and move on. I'm much more, I go back to people now. I try and stay in touch with people, if I can. And I'll almost always ask them if they want to print. 9 times out of 10 they say no. But it's the actual approaching, to actually answer your question, is that it's being nice. I mean, it really is. I do believe that every person I approach and talk to is because I'm genuinely interested in them, and I think that's. I mean, I don't want to pat myself on the back too much, because there's certainly the idea of voyeurism, and there's a power dynamic, but I want to learn something, and if I don't feel like I learned something, that's not a good picture, I don't think. So that's, the conversations are almost more important, but that's, again, it's the conversations aren't the photographs, that's the conversations are for me, and the photographs end up being something completely different, which can be a complicated thing to navigate down the road for people too, because the photographs might end up having a completely different meaning than the person that I was talking to, because of how I use them in the edit. So, yeah.
Okay, piggyback. Is there any constructive narrative, or do you ever intervene? If you do, how do you
Constructing narrative in
images and how you?
I mean, I don't really I don't think about individual images really that often. I think that they always kind of need their buddy next to them, which is just how I work. So and that's, again, it's I kind of hope that you as the viewer can see that, and you might, I could tell you the story. I could tell you most people's names and tell you about the tattoos on their face or whatever, because I talked to them about that. But that's kind of, if you can construct that yourself, and that's what I'm saying, I guess, is that you probably see that woman Elena with her tattoos on her face, and it's like a little jarring, but it was actually a really beautiful story that she was telling me about why, and so it ends up being kind of two separate paths, I think. So I hope you can construct your own narrative, and that's sort of what I want you to do, but also the narrative of how the book is built, how the story is built together is important as well.
More comments and fewer questions, but still, with the limits or contradictions, there are lots of people in there, and of course, as you know, you've got some real good critical acclaim for that book, and yet there were some locals who had a problem with it. And it reminded me of, and I'm not saying you're Robert Frank or anything, but you're good. But, with the Americans, the publishers thought, that's not America, that's not my America. And it wasn't until it started making money and they're like, oh yeah, that is my America.
Yeah.
So what I'm, so there is that issue. And I know students all have questions about how do you take pictures of people and then what happens. You and I have talked about Kensington Blues,
Yeah.
and how, is that problematic? You're not doing the same thing, but I think they're all good questions to ask as you're shooting people, and then you go on to the poetry of Good Bones.
Right.
It's like really an interesting transition. No questions, sorry folks.
Well, I will say, in that, the other, this is what I was saying about going around with your 35 millimeter black and white camera in 1998 is very different than going around with a big digital camera in 2025, where the image ends up is much more of a real thing, and it's not as innocent as even Robert Frank, where those books the pictures end up in a book, and the book goes out to this crowd right here, where now these images, they go on the internet and like wildfire take off. And so, what happened very specifically with the local is that's what happened. It was published in The Guardian, or the pretty lazy journalism, The Guardian, which then found its way back into some of my favorite Facebook groups about Greenfield. And and it was a really mixed bag, which, it put me in a real state. You have to kind of read through the lines, but because it was people who was like, he's an artist, so let him do it. And everyone's like, that's not Greenfield, blah, blah, blah. That's Turner's Falls. That was my best. The best I actually got in the mail, they found my address, and I got a letter, a computer type letter. I should bring this with me wherever I go. It's really my favorite thing. But the whole thing is like, imagine my surprise. I bought 2 copies of the book, and I was like, thank you. And I opened it, and my family, my brother-in-law's family is from there, and it was nothing like that. Why didn't you photograph the fair or the horse pull? Or they only said things that happened at the Franklin County Fair, and I was like, well, that's all. I do photograph that too, but
That book exists already, I think.
it should exist. The fair is also. I'm actually working on another book about the fair, and it's also not that happy. So.
Send her a copy for free.
Any last comments or questions or thoughts or feelings or observations?
What is an imperfect rainbow, and why isn't it pretty?
So I can just show you. Well, this is an imperfect rainbow. And there's more. This one is an imperfect rainbow. That's an imperfect rainbow. This is the obvious imperfect rainbow. And the thought about that is that the rainbow is this, it's optimism. It's this moment of joy in a cloudy sky, and so that's why, as a trope in here, it's used that way. Where it's always, this is, and there's stickers over there. Help yourself. But the shredding of this sort of, and I just love that because that's grew up with the same sticker on my car, and it's just worn and beaten up, or you know, full of this like ceiling fan that's full of a bird's nest. I mean, this one, I mean, why did you do it, Kyle Scott? And so just becomes a thing of where you're trying to find this sort of ideal. And that's why the last image is that really perfect rainbow, kind of amazing rainbow. Is that it's a moment of optimism. Finding that. So I don't know if that answered the question of what is an imperfect rainbow, but that's they're broken somehow.
Last thoughts or questions? Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.